All right, well, welcome everyone to another episode of the Wilkes-Barre Connect Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Kimbrough, and today here with me is Julie Sidoni from WVIA. Thank you very much.
I'm really happy to be here, Dan.
And today we're going to have a little conversation. We're here at LEAD talking about activism and education. Not activism, sorry. I've lost the word I'm looking for. Advocacy and education, thinking about politics and these things. And one of the big things that most people are getting their information from media. And we have a real issue in this country where there's a lot of false news that is actually not real news, not the term false news used by others, and in a lot of citizen journalism and people who are sharing information, but it's not vetted. And so the idea is let's have a conversation around the idea of media literacy and what it means, but why it's also so important, especially when we're talking about legislation and people making laws. Why is knowing not so much just the news, but where you get your news from and how to decipher what's valid and what's not valid important?
It is so critical, number one, and it's also rapidly changing. So I don't mind saying how old I am. I graduated from college in the year 2000, and in the year 2000, it wasn't there, social media wasn't a thing, and I didn't even have a cell phone, right? So when you talk about media literacy, you're talking about those quote unquote legacy sort of media organizations, your newspapers, your television programs. You may have had a couple of startup online really early on, thousands, journalism sort of, nonprofit groups here or there. But you didn't have the choice that you have now. And so media literacy when I was a journalism student was, hey, you know what you should all do, everybody? Watch all the stations, read all the papers, and go to all the websites eventually. And that will give you a great way of seeing what went on in your day that day. And that is just not the case anymore. That shift happened very, very quickly, where suddenly social media is here and now your options are everywhere. There is news everywhere. It is, well, whether you want to call it news, information, whatever, wherever you are getting information is everywhere. And so the whole idea of who do you trust to give you that information, that's a really interesting question that I can't answer for anybody. I know who it is for me. I know what it is for me. But I do think that people need to take a pretty close look at where they get the bulk of their information from. And it's okay that it's social media. I think a lot of people get information on social media, but I used to teach public speaking class at Wilkes, and I used to drill down into this, like, who is your source on that? Yeah, you found that online. Who's your source on that? And so just one day, if somebody reads a headline anywhere, I would kind of give them a little homework. Drill down to see if you can figure out exactly where that information came from. Do you know the reporter? Do you know the organization? Do you know the people they talked to? You probably don't. It's okay that you don't, but just as a little bit of an exercise, I would love if people would really drill down really deep, think about it for 5 minutes, one story. Where did that come from? And why should I be critical about that information?
And you said that you made a distinction between the idea of news and information. What do you mean there?
Well, that is always debated. I'll let you into, if you listen to WVIA radio, you will hear your arts, news, and information station. And we had this whole discussion. Is news information? Yes, no, I don't this is the kind of thing we were talking about. I think there can be information given that's not necessarily news, but we're in the weeds here. Whatever it is whatever method you use to gather information, I don't make the distinction, but others do.
Yeah. And so in this notion of media literacy and the fact that we are flooded with so much content at this point, how, and I know you can't answer for each individual, but what is that process? What things should we be looking for in what we're finding? Because you're right. Just because I found it on Facebook doesn't mean it's not real. It could be from the New York Times on Facebook. That just happens to be where I found it as opposed to picking up the physical New York Times.
Sure.
Not the same story, probably written differently, but same information is there. And so if good information does exist online and all these other places, what are the things we should be doing to vet those things, to make sure that it is actually the NewYorkTimes.com and not NewYorkTimes.something else, and this isn't a real article?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wish I knew the answer to that question, because what I see out there, gosh, there is so much misinformation and so much disinformation, but I don't think it takes much to figure out that it's bad information. Yeah. I just think that people are very used to scrolling or looking, or they want to pick up the phone, they want to text their friend or something. I actually do put a little bit of the responsibility on the person with the phone in their hand or with the remote in their hand, because I can't stop that bad information is out there, but I certainly can stop that I share it.
Right.
So whether let's say you found something that you thought was good information and shared it widely and it wasn't good information, is that your fault?
Yeah, technically.
Yes, it is. Technically, you didn't put it out there. But in other words, we are all sort of journalists on Facebook or social media. If you're sharing a story that you want other people to know about, you're kind of the journalist, and you should be the one vetting that information. Yeah. I wish people thought about it a little more critically, because really we have seen how quickly stories can fly. We can see how quickly bad stories get out there. Yeah. And I think in many cases, it's not necessarily the primary source. It's what has happened after the story got out there that then was widely shared. And maybe the mistake was made there. So it's vast. It's wide open. But I think there are telltale signs to when something is just not totally right.
Okay. And going off of that, in the conversation around media literacy, how does WVIA separate itself, and this is sort of that bigger picture of what is public media versus what is broadcast media versus what is network media, and sort of explaining that difference, because people think, the media is bad. It's like, there's no media overall. But like, what is that difference between public media and what WVIA does, and how does it differ from a WBRE? And then how does it differ from an MSNBC?
I'll answer that, but I first want to say that there was a time when I refused to use the word media. Not anymore. I mean, who am I on my soapbox here? But media is such a huge plural word. Yeah. It means everybody. It means every reporter, every newspaper, every blog, every radio station. There are a lot of bad cops out there. There's some really good ones too. A lot of bad teachers out there, really good ones too. And I'm going to say the same thing about journalists. Yep. There's some really bad people with a pen and a microphone out there. There are also some really amazing people with the microphone and a pen out there. So number one, media I don't love just because it's
a catch-all that isn't work.
All encompassing, and I don't think it's fair. Yeah. That's number one. So network, the definition of network, I don't really have much to do with a network, and I didn't even when I was working in commercial television, all those years at WNEP. Networks just say, hey, we're ABC, we're CBS, we're NBC, you're going to carry our stuff. When we decide we're going to break in, you're going to break in. That's mostly the relationship. But part of my job at WVIA in public media was a lot of education on commercial versus public media. In commercial media, you have a budget at the beginning of the year, and here you go. This is advertising. This is this. This is this. This is this. There you go. In public media, it almost works backwards. I can say, I want this, 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 and this. But if foundations or donors don't step forward with that, that's a wish list. So part of what I have to do is figure out what the community needs. We're doing a huge listening tour. I'll talk about that in a minute. We're doing a huge listening tour to try to figure out what the community really needs, as opposed to in commercial where we said, we know news and now we're going to tell you about it. And then we're going to try to make you watch it, and we're going to try to make you share it, and we're going to try to make you want it. Yeah. We're taking the other tack, which is, what do you want us to do? What stories are we not covering? What stories do we not know about? Send us there. Help us get there.
And how's that working out?
I think, it's slow. But I think, I like to say we're a slow-moving ship. Public media in general is kind of a slow-moving ship, right? But I think it's going very, very well, because we're really in it for the right reasons. We're starting to ask people, what is it they want to see? What are you tired of hearing about? What do you not need to hear about? Is there a topic that we haven't gotten into? Yeah. That's kind of what we're doing right now. But I'm a bit off topic.
No, you're good.
That's just the differences between public and commercial. So we aren't beholden to any advertisers, and we aren't beholden to any corporations. And I cannot underscore how important that is, because news, as we know, is a business. It's expensive. News is expensive to put on, and most people think they get it for free because they turn on their TV or they pay a couple bucks for their newspaper subscription. News is very expensive to produce. It's even more expensive to produce well. And so it doesn't surprise me that people go for quicker, easier. Yeah, well, they had that first, but maybe that person who is your next door neighbor didn't totally have it right. Yeah, but she knows. You know, that's what we deal with quite a bit, is people who are more likely to trust something they see on social media versus something they see in traditional media. There's a lot. Listen, we did this to ourselves.
Very true.
We did this to ourselves, and we deserve a lot of the criticism that we're getting, 100%. But all I can do is try to get out of the commercial for-profit part of things and break it down to the super hyper local. What do you need from me? And if you have a problem, when you call, it's me you're talking to, or Faith Gole, or someone else who's local and lives here and also cares about this area, as opposed to a company that's Lord knows where, that has a bunch of affiliates. And I am not saying that those places don't do good news. Please don't misunderstand. It's just a different thing when you can call a local nonprofit public media journalism center and say, here's my problem. There's one of 10 people who are gonna talk to you and say, okay, I can handle that problem. So I think it's a completely different model from anything I've ever seen. But we have to do something, because the old model is 100% not working.
100%, I agree. Can you talk to me about some of the things that you've learned from this listening tour then?
Oh yeah, this is so. One of our community engagement VPs said, this is a joke. He said, you know what we should do? We should visit 22 counties in 22 weeks. And we were like, oh crap, why did you say that? Because sure enough, what comes next is, let's do a listening tour. We needed to do the listening tour. We're in the middle of it now. Our market area, who we cover, is enormous. It's not our choice. The FCC makes these rules. So WNEP and all of the other bigger, WBREs, you talked about BRE and WYOU, we all cover the same 22 county. Well, maybe it's not 22, but it could be 19, 20-ish. You see what I'm trying to say. We go west to Williamsport, all the way north to the New York border, all the way east through the Poconos to New Jersey, and south almost to Harrisburg, down through Pottsville. It's a lot of ground to cover. And what that means is people in Williamsport, they've never even been to Scranton. They don't care about Scranton. There are people in Wilkes-Barre who don't care about Scranton, who've never been. I mean, I'm not kidding.
Oh, I know.
There's rural areas that need vastly different things from us than Hazleton does, than Williamsport does, than East Stroudsburg does. So we knew we had to get into those communities and say, hi, we're here. We're new. Hi, we're new here. What do you want from us? And you would be surprised how different those answers are. But there is also some through lines. And I'll just give you one example. One through line is housing. Everybody's having a problem with housing, affordable housing. You have your beautiful developments. You have your Section 8 housing. There is nothing in the middle that people are having a really hard time affording housing. So even though people might have different needs and wants, we are learning some through lines for stories that we can do that'll hit everybody.
Gotcha.
Right.
And that's one of those things that is interesting. Living around the country is that it is a very different market. That you have 22 counties that are such geographically different than one another as well. It's like you may be in somewhere else in the Midwest where it may be 5 counties, but they're all similar. And
we got hardcore Democrats, hardcore Republicans.
Well, and the urban to the rural and all these different things, and where people that are doing a lot of tech things that are very agricultural based in these things. And so how in managing that, yes, there's the through lines, so there are stories that you can tell, but then how do you meet the needs of someone who's in Williamsport who could care less about what Paige is doing in Scranton, but then the person in Scranton could really care less about what's going on in Williamsport?
In fact, I'm not trying to cause trouble here, but there's almost like an anti-Scranton Wilkes-Barre sort of, if you're out there, like if you're in Towanda, for instance, and they will sort of look at you like you're the city girl. And I'll say, I grew up in the middle of the woods. I am not a city girl, but they think because you are representing an organization that came from Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, you're somehow the big city coming in here telling us what to do. It's fascinating.
Wow.
It's fascinating. So you really have to figure out who you're talking to and what in particular they need from you. To answer your question about Williamsport, what we did was foundations have been very hesitant to fund or give donations to nonprofit media in the past, because it's not a direct service. It's not, I'm taking this food and putting it in this child's mouth, which we all understand. It's really hard to quantify what journalism does for an area. But now funders are taking notice, and that happened in Williamsport. We were able to secure a grant to put a reporter embedded in I used embedded, I probably shouldn't say, that's like a military thing, but he lives there in downtown Williamsport and is only covering Williamsport and Lycoming County.
Wow. And
that was funded by foundations who called me to say, even like the mayor and the commissioners are saying, reporters aren't calling me anymore. And I would joke, I've joked with Paige, as a matter of fact, you want reporters to call you? Are you sure? And she laughs and says, yes, I do. There's no other way for us to get what we're doing out there to, like, we'll take the conflict. We need these stories to get out there. And so in Williamsport, this wasn't happening anymore. It was a bit of a news desert. A foundation stepped forward and said, here you go. So 6 months in, we have a reporter there working. He is doing a great job. He's doing some nice, fun stories about the bookstore that's been there forever and the festivals and things. Obviously, the Little League World Series in South Williamsport is huge. But he's also filing a lot of right-to-know requests because there's some things happening at City Hall that we can't get to the bottom of.
Gotcha.
That gets tricky, because are those officials going to want to keep funding you if you are digging into them? You see the issue. Yeah. But you got to do what you got to do. We're doing our best to give the people of Williamsport, I know it's only one small, tiny area, but that's our way of serving them better. And we hope that that is a model that we can take to the Poconos and to Pottsville and to the Northern Tier and anywhere else. It's not just geographic, too. What I wanted to say was we also recently hired a healthcare reporter. And that also came from foundations, not one foundation, but a bunch of them who said, okay, I'll give some if they give some. All right, well, I'll give some if they give some. All right, well, I'll give some if they give some. And pretty soon we have a reporter now, and she is not regional.
Right.
She's not from one area.
Okay.
She is to do healthcare stories around the we could use 10 of her, actually. There's a lot of health news going on. So that's a long answer to your short question about how we can hopefully try to replicate it and serve a big coverage area when we have 11 people and they're all based in Pittston, except Chase.
And so that shift to the idea of being able to do hyper-focused stories while still covering a region, do you think that's where we're going to see media sort of switch to? Because there was that time about 15, 20 years ago where there was a lot of the consolidation. Instead of you're this one station that does this here, now you're the media group and you cover all of this. And a lot of smaller municipalities and places around the country lost out on having that reporter who was there or who lived down the street. Do you think there's going to be a return to that maybe, or?
I think it's all a pendulum. And back in the day, you had very maybe widely reported news, and it's kind of going, I think, the other way. I think the nationalization of news is why we are here. That's why we're doing what we're doing. The nationalization of anything really is why we're doing what we're doing. That again, it's not as though any other organization has subpar coverage. That is not true. In fact, I'm a big fan of media in general. I love all the stations. I read all of the newspapers, and those they're my colleagues. Those are people who really know what they're doing out there. Right. So it's not just please watch VIA or listen to VIA. It's really pay attention to the people in your community who are doing this job every day. Because I don't think we're going to go. I think we are headed back toward this little bit hyper local. Think about high school sports.
Right.
So I grew up in an area I was 2.5 hours away from any media coverage really. And on a Friday night, we would race home to sit in front of the TV just to see if it was scrolled across the bottom. If we just saw do you remember? Like just scrolling across the bottom was a big enough deal for us to all race home and see that. I remember that.
Gotcha.
When it's when a news organization can pay attention to something that's really important to you, your high school, your church, your community, your workplace, you pay attention.
And so I guess my next question would be then that notion of when we talk about media, Most people are usually talking about national and bigger things and not realizing that it's people in your backyard who are actually giving you the stories you're getting at home. And that those are probably the more important stories. Because if we move away from that national, if you're worried about housing, what's happening at a national level is not going to really affect you so much as what you're going to hear in the evening news. How do we get people to realize that? And there may be an answer to that, but that it's the local reports and that's what really matters for you on a day-to-day basis. How do we get people to realize that your angst is at something that doesn't really affect you anymore?
The angst comes from not trusting someone with your story. Mm-hmm. I understand that. It's really hard to tell someone details about your life and then trust them to handle that. Isn't it? Think about it. Yeah. I know you've been interviewed. Anybody else been interviewed before? Like, it's a little strange, right? Because even if you trust that organization or that person, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, should I say that? Did that come out wrong? Oh, crap. Is my boss going to not like that? Did I sound, it's really hard. I understand it's hard. Yeah. Even if it's just a written, whatever the case may be, sharing your story with someone else and then letting it go out in the world is very difficult. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm going to go back to something I said in the beginning. If you can find someone locally, and you'll be able to identify someone based on who you watch, who you read, what you're doing, you will find a number of reporters or people whose style you like, or who seems like, okay, yeah, I liked that story he or she did on this. Contact them. People might think it's a here and here sort of thing, and we're on opposite sides. Gotcha. And we are not. We need people. We need your story ideas, and you need us to help get those story ideas out there. We are true partners in this. Mm-hmm. We can't do any of this without people trusting us. And I take that really, really seriously. Mm-hmm. So, I'm never going to say I can guarantee someone coverage on a story, but I can almost guarantee that if you pitch a good story and we keep talking about that and the right time comes up or the right situation comes up, I'm going to do that story. Mm-hmm. We need stories every day. Yeah. So it's a relationship that I wish people were a little more comfortable with. Again, that's on journalists because we've ruined that for everyone. Honestly, we are not all, very, very few of us are out to get you because we're going to lose our jobs that way. Right. I live here. I'm not going to want to make everybody mad. This is my home. Yeah. So I'm going to be, the information that I put out there is really going to be the best information I can come up with because this is my community.
I think it's important for people to realize that at a local level, there are people you can reach out to help get that story out there, and that it's not always sort of the national thing. Like this. In your backyard, there are ways to help share that information and maybe, and again, not guarantee the story, but there's an ear at least somewhere where someone's at least willing to hear what you have to say about these things.
I actually even think that people, I don't want to say they pay too much attention to national. That's not true. You should obviously pay attention to what's going on, but the decisions that are made on the presidential or the national level are far less part of your life than the decisions made by your school board and your township supervisors and your commissioners. Yeah. Those are the decisions that affect your pocketbook. Those are the decisions that affect what you're buying, where you're spending, your drug costs, where you're parking, where you live, where you send your kids to school. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of attention given to national topics, but I really think it's the local topics that we want to talk about more and that affect people's lives more in depth.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. And so in wrapping up, the notion of this idea of vetting sources and getting to know your local media people and working on this idea of trust. If there are young folks who are listening or watching and not so much that media is where they're looking to go, but the idea of advocacy and storytelling, what would you tell them? What advice would you give?
I had an argument once in a class I was teaching. Mm-hmm. It was a young journalism student who basically said, the way of doing news that you used to do is over. It's done. It's dead. We are social activist journalists. We're going to pick a topic and we're going to hit it really hard. And I said, okay, there is room for that out there. Just understand there's not room for that in a traditional media organization. Right. So when we talk about vetting, it's not so much vetting a person. Like I'm like, I'll tell you anything about me you want to know. You don't have to do a background check on me. It's not about vetting me personally, right? But vet vet where you get your information from most of the time, if not the person. Then look at the body of work, look at the source, look at the, who's sharing that with me on my social media feed? Is it all of the people who get riled up all the time? Or is this a friend? That's what I mean about vetting. It's less an official process, but you think, that friend shared it? Well, that's interesting. Just think a little bit more about all of the filters that have to happen before you see a particular story.
And sort of try to trace it back to where it started.
And go right back to where that.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Julie. This has been really amazing.